Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rowan Petts, Executive Director of AustCham Korea. Today, it's my pleasure to be hosting a North Korea update, Rumours, Risk and Economic Implications, with two very special guest speakers. Chado Carroll, founder and CEO of Korea Risk, NK News and NK Pro, and with his colleague, analyst Peter Ward.
And this is my colleague Peter, and we work at an organization focused on North Korea called Korea Risk Group. And today we're going to be giving you a quick briefing on the recent rumours which have been coming up in the DPRK, as well as some economic trends of concern, which could also pose their own form of risk. For those of you who don't know, Korea Risk Group, we publish three types of things. We've got NK News, which is a day-to-day general news portal on North Korea. We've got our NK News podcast, which is a service hosted by Jacko Zvetslu. Lots of fascinating interviews with specialists on North Korea. And we also run NK Pro, which is a service designed to help professionals understand what's going on in North Korea, manage risk, forecast what may be happening on the short to medium term. So yeah, today I'm going to give you a quick 15-minute presentation, and then Peter will also follow up with about 10-15 minutes on the economic stuff. So I'm going to talk about Kim Jong-un disappearing and what we really know about his absence, the two types of risk that we believe exist if there is a sudden health-related incident in North Korea, and what to do in the event of a change in DPRK. So Kim Jong-un's last appearance before all this rumor mongering kicked off was on April 12th, and very quickly it turned into a deluge of news stories and serious concern about the leader's health. He was away for about just under 2 weeks, and during that period, some very unusual things actually did happen in North Korea, which I'd like to draw your attention to. So the first thing to bear in mind is that the last time we heard from him on April 12th, there were two reports of him making appearances, which is kind of unusual. But the interesting thing was both of them reportedly took place on April 10th or 11th. And Daily NK, the South Korean outlet, was first in saying that Kim Jong-un had a health-related or heart-related procedure on April 12th. So the dates kind of line up with his last appearance. Now, after he disappeared on April 14th, we had this very strange notification that there'd been a set of cruise missile tests in North Korea. Missile tests take place all the time, but what was odd about this is that the South Korean government announced it through a background briefing about 6 or 7 hours after it happened. Usually these things are announced in real time. And so we were a bit puzzled by what was going on there. And it was also peppered with lots of detail about North Korean Air Force activities. And most strangely, the day after April 15th, the North Koreans usually publish photos of these successful missile tests. There was nothing. And we don't know why. That's only usually the case when there's been a missile failure. Another odd thing was on April 15th, the Day of the Sun, which is the North Korean equivalent of Independence Day, I guess. We would have expected Kim Jong-un to appear. We would have expected under these flowers for there to be large sets of flowers donated or sent by Kim Jong-un. None of those appeared on April 15th, which was very, very odd indeed. And he didn't make any appearance that day. And again, this is like a US president missing a massive event like Independence Day in the US. Another odd thing was at Wonsan Kalma, this new tourist resort that's being built out on the East Coast. This was a project that was meant to be wrapped up by April 15th. And yet again, April 15th went with zero news whatsoever about the status of this project. And that is despite this project being delayed 3 times, personally, by Kim Jong-un. So something very odd happened seemingly there as well. So after all these strange events, we saw rumours really start to hit the fan on around April 20th when Daily NK is reporting about the cardiovascular procedure kicked off. And CNN then picked it up, Bloomberg, NBC and Reuters. And amongst all these media, and I don't doubt they had sources making claims of these things, the rumors got crazier and crazier. Kim Jong-un was dead. He was about to die. He was brain dead. 50 Chinese doctors had rushed over to North Korea to help him, you name it. Now, reporting about the leadership in North Korea is extremely difficult. Even if you've got good sources, we didn't really believe we'd be able to do much on this story because of that. But what we did do was tap into people in Pyongyang and the surrounding areas and found out that basically through this whole crisis in Western media, life was just ticking on as normal. We did, however, notice some luxury boat movements in the east coast port of Wonsan around April 14th, 15th, which our colleague Colin Zverko, who detected this, believed could be sign that Kim Jong-un was alive and well and out in his palatial manor on the east coast. Now you fast forward about 10 more days and Kim Jong-un reappeared on May 1st on a Saturday morning edition of the state newspaper Boron Shinmun. Though he reappeared, there were a few strange signs. Firstly, Kim Jong-un was seen in this golf buggy, which we sometimes see, but it's quite rare. And one of the last times we did see it was in late 2014 after Kim Jong-un disappeared for a period of 40 days. And we know he had ankle surgery during this time and needed the golf buggy at that time to get around because he was quite unfit and needed a cane. So it's quite interesting that this buggy re-emerged. Could be coincidence, but quite notable nonetheless. The other thing we noticed was that Kim Jong-un re-emerged with this strange spot on his arm. Now, you can see in the picture on the left, this was actually the last time Kim Jong-un showed up in state media. The spot is not there, and it's there after this 2-week disappearance or 20-day disappearance. Some doctors we spoke to suggested it could be what's called a right radial artery puncture for cardiovascular treatment. Others disagreed, but it's notable that that emerged. Now, regardless of whether or not Kim Jong-un is healthy in those pictures, when you look at the data of the appearances that he's been making in April and May every single year since becoming leader, though we've still got 12 days left in May, you can see there are only 4 appearances in April and May 2020. And if you go back to 2012, in the same period of time, we were looking at just under 50 appearances. So something is clearly restricting his ability to appear in public at the same kind of frequency as we would normally expect during this time of the year. Now, some suggest COVID-19 is why he's maybe not making so many appearances. I would say that if that's true, why are the senior elites around him so frequently not shown wearing masks? Now, regardless of when we see Kim Jong-un come back or not, I would just note that today it's been another 18 days since he was last on state media. It's clear that unless Kim Jong-un makes some lifestyle changes soon, his health is probably going to continue declining. He's obviously not the leanest of individuals. He is known to smoke still, doesn't seem to take top-notch care of his health, and those problems are going to continue to prevail most likely, which means that the risk of surgery or sudden death obviously continues to grow as the months and years go by. And if anything, we did learn this April and May that when one of these contingency situations emerges, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. And so the question I'd like to ask is, what risk does Kim Jong-un's health pose the business world? I'd say there are 2 potential scenarios in determining the risk levels that we'll see. And this all relates to really the robustness of the leadership succession plans in North Korea. Why? Because if there is a poorly thought out succession plan, it really increases the risk of division emerging domestically between key stakeholders. So the very high risk, but in my opinion, low probability situation is relating to serious uncertainty over succession. Now, Kim Jong-un is a young leader. His children are thought to be no older than 10 or 11. So there's very limited prospects for the traditional father-to-son transfer of power. So if Kim Jong-un wants to keep power in the family, that only really leaves his siblings or his father's siblings as potential candidates. And if the succession is to work, I would argue that a decision or nomination of that successor needs to have been made ideally to both the general public of North Korea and the senior elites, but at the bare minimum to the senior elites. The problem is, due to his young age, it's conceivable that Kim may not have given much thought to this issue. I personally haven't written a will yet. Kim Jong-un is the same age as me. It's possible that he is confident he'll live for many more decades to come, and we'll think about these things later on. The other uncertainty is that if he has made a pick and it's someone within his family, the two obvious options would be Kim Yo-jong, his sister, or Kim Pyong-il, Kim Jong-il's brother, who was the former North Korean ambassador to a number of posts in Europe. The problem is these two characters may not have the authority and legitimacy in the view of many North Koreans to lead through a fourth generation power transfer. I'd say that's probably quite possible with Kim Pyong-il, who's been out of the country for a very long time and probably doesn't have very good network there. So that's one risk, and that translates into some quite serious potential problems. If in the days after a potential death of Kim Jong-un, we have a question mark over who is going to lead North Korea, we could see this translating into military activity such as border security dissipating, large-scale internal movements, potential for domestic clashes. Almost certainly, the political instability will translate into sharp currency fluctuations, availability of internal commodities changing. Regionally, we'll see stock market indexes crash, and unlike after a normal death of a North Korean leader, the rebound might take a lot longer as the situation plays out. There's a risk of foreign intervention if rivaling factions in North Korea start potentially considering deliberate military actions towards China, South Korea, Japan to try and incite some kind of foreign intervention in their favor. And of course, the biggest worry is uncertainty over North Korea's weapons of mass destruction. Who will control them? Will they be used? Etc. etc. Now, I think the much more likely outcome is that we will see status quo prevail, even if there's a sudden health-related incident in the short to medium term. While Kim Jong-un is an autocrat, it's important to bear in mind that he's built his power on domestic interests which transcend the national, regional, and local lines. So within the bureaucracy, the military authorities, the security services, there are tens of thousands of mid to high-ranking North Koreans who are all regular recipients of privilege, be it political, financial, cultural, or otherwise. And all of these people will generally have a vested interest in supporting whichever successor is designated by Kim. So I think that's important to bear in mind. And this isn't just a North Korea specific phenomena. For similar reasons to in North Korea, sudden deaths of leaders in other autocratic systems are actually seldom accompanied by major changes or domestic upheaval. There's a great 2016 study by Erica France and Andrea Kendall-Taylor, which showed that in the year after a sudden death, 80% of the time, regime stability prevails. Interestingly, 5 years after a death in dictatorships, you usually see regime stability prevail because, unlike a coup, there is no generally dissatisfied population when a leader passes away. And so for similar reasons, I would actually argue that even though Kim Yo-jong is a woman, and a lot of people have suggested that instantly makes her unsuitable for the job in a country which has been really inculcated with a culture of men in leadership roles, I would suggest that there's a very good probability that it will be in the interests of key institutions and individuals and business people to support her. Nevertheless, there's potential also for risk, even with a small transfer of power. We also are likely to see spikes in currency and in availability of commodities. Again, you'll see stock market shocks. The Kospi dropped some 3.5% when Kim Jong-il died. The key thing is you're probably likely to see conventional military risks. The year that Kim Jong-un came to power in 2010, we had the sinking of the Chonan. We had the shelling of Yeonpyeong-do. We had major inter-Korean friction in the years after in 2013 and 2015. That could be part of the course for whoever leads the country next. More potential for purges. We saw this after Kim Jong-un. That can always have unpredictable outcomes, and probably a ongoing pursuit of WMD in the way that Kim Jong-un has done, which also leads to potential for serious friction with the US. So just to wrap up, in the event that we do see a announcement on North Korean TV one day that the leader has died, how do we know if it's going to be those two scenarios? I think there are some key indicators which help us know whether it's going to be the status quo or not. If the speed of the news is quick, i.e. if we hear of death being publicly broadcast within a day or two of the actual death, that's probably a good sign, because it means there is not a high level of uncertainty which may be delaying news of the decision. If we see unusual military movements, missile testing, that's something to be concerned about, because it would be a break from the norm. If we see a funeral with potentially delayed or lacking lots of key figures, that would be another reason to be concerned. It could be a sign of behind the scenes problems. If we start seeing contradictory news and information in state media, that would be another big issue of concern, because it could suggest that there's been a breakdown in the coherence of the propaganda apparatus. And if those domestic economic problems I've touched upon in both the two prior scenarios emerge but are not dealt with quickly, that would also be a suggestion that things are not going well. And in terms of monitoring all of that kind of information, I highly recommend, of course, that you use our NK Pro service, because you can find all of that in our product on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to pass over to Peter, who's going to quickly touch upon some concerning things that we're seeing in the North Korean economy right now.
Yeah, so if Chad has not given you enough reason to worry, then I'm here to give you more reason to worry. Although hopefully not so much that that we all start to panic, because I don't think it is time to panic yet. But I think that we need to keep a very close eye on the situation inside North Korea, because North Korea's economic situation, though it most of the time it doesn't affect us day to day, if there is a serious economic crisis in the North, we will all need to sit up and take notice. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what may be in store for us in the next 6 months or a year, if we're unlucky. So just by way of a very quick self-introduction, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna. I'm also a contributing analyst here at NK Pro. I've been researching North Korea for about 10 years. My work mainly focuses on North Korean economic institutions, organization, and development. But when I have a chance, all I'm doing is reading North Korean documents and analyzing their price data, because some of us actually think that's the funnest thing in the entire universe to do. That's me. Anyways, so why should we care? So very, very quickly, I understand that a lot of the things I'm going to say to you, now may seem a bit like trivia, may seem very distant and far away. But remember, North Korea is right next to South Korea and also China, and across the pond from Japan. It has a population of 25 million people. It also has plenty of nuclear weapons and ICBMs that could potentially be tested or otherwise used in the event of some kind of dramatic events unfolding in the North. It's a huge potential menace to regional stability. And if Kim Jong-un were to die, be overthrown, or his regime were to somehow otherwise be significantly affected by social instability, it could be a big mess that we'll all have to deal with. Not just us here in Seoul, but also people around the world. So by way of a very short introduction to the North Korean economy, I think a very useful way to think about it is North Korea is an economy almost entirely dominated by the state. With very few exceptions, the state owns all productive property. It controls all labor, all capital, and all essential assets. The only other the only other two entities that are legally allowed to exist in North Korea, aside from the state, are joint ventures, which are partially owned by foreigners and also partially owned by state entities, and households, which aren't directly owned by the state. And as a result, some household activities are tolerated, and some household market activities are legally tolerated, and other activities are considered to be black market and illegal, but still done by households or by state-owned enterprises or by private individuals working inside the state. So what that means for all intents and purposes is, legally speaking, you have households and you have the state. And unofficially, you also have private actors of various kinds who act in what you could consider to be the grey and black market sector. And, you know, there are gradations of grey and black market, but yeah, basically we have a very, very large black market sector, which allows the North Korean economy to continue to function in the ruins of socialism, as it were. Excuse me. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to the North Korean economy, and it's worth knowing that before then looking at what's going on now. As many of you will be aware, since 2016, North Korea has been under one of the harshest sanction regimes in the world, and there are good reasons for that, of course. We're not here to debate whether it's a good idea to sanction them, but anyway, they were very significantly sanctioned in 2016 and 17. Oil imports, I think, were restricted to 2 million barrels, 4 million barrels?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. I should have written it down. I believe it's either 2 or 4 million barrels of oil, maximum amount that the North Koreans are able to procure from overseas. I left it out of my slides. Sorry about that. But nonetheless, in spite of these sanctions, fuel prices have remained stable, and they've basically been fluctuating within a normal band of about 1 to 2 and 1 to 3 of what you would see in the US fuel market. So if you look at US petrol and diesel prices and compare them to North Korea, yes, diesel is much cheaper at the pumps in the United States, but it's only a ratio of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. The same thing, basically, in spite of sanctions, North Korea was not until very recently affected. Its fuel markets were not really affected for most of the time. North Korean exchange rates have been stable, food prices have also been stable. So basically, until very recently, in spite of maximum pressure, big increase in the amount of economic sanctions and restrictions on North Korean trade activities, North Korea's economy was largely weathering the storm. But since the coronavirus has hit, we've seen a massive uptick in volatility. You know, Forex has been moving around quite violently. Dollar and RMB exchange rates against the won. Food prices have also spiked, and fuel prices are well above where they were before the coronavirus hit, and also well above international benchmarks. I'm sure many of you know that the WTI, the West Texas Intermediate benchmark for crude oil, went negative last month. Many other oil benchmarks have lost a tremendous amount of value in the last couple of months because of coronavirus. There's been a huge withdrawal of demand from the market, and there's been a glut of supply. We've not seen the same thing in North Korea. If anything, quite the reverse. North Korean fuel prices are up where they were prior to the coronavirus hitting. There have also been reports from Daily NK and NK News of panic buying in shops, of imports. And basically what I would stress to all of you is this is what maximum pressure was supposed to look like when it was dreamt up in 2016-17. It was supposed to inflict pain on North Korean markets. It was supposed to hit North Korean fuel prices. It was supposed to drain the regime and, by extension, the market of Forex, foreign exchange. The idea being that you inflict pain on the North Korean government in order to force it to the bargaining table to negotiate away its nuclear weapons and some of its missile programs. That was the idea behind the sanctions, and they were not working until coronavirus hit. And suddenly we had evidence of what people had been looking for all along, that sanctions were having an effect on North Korean prices. So there are signs that this is just the beginning. And I just want to briefly tell you about that before telling you why you shouldn't panic. So the North Korean government has recently announced internally, and we know through de facto media run by people who have sources inside the country at the market level, that the North Korean government has quietly started to issue bonds in two forms: foreign currency bonds to richer individuals, and that's 40% of 40%. So you have bonds, right? 40% of those bonds are being issued in foreign currency to wealthy individuals, and the other 60% of the bonds being issued are being issued in kind, so to enterprises and state organizations. So what that means is, I imagine some of you are familiar with the concept of a resource-backed loan. It's like, for instance, an oil state will borrow money and secure it against future deliveries of oil, as it were. And this is the reverse. So the state is borrowing resources in exchange for future repayment in cash. What cash exactly? Unclear. Whether these bondholders will ever be repaid, also highly unclear. Whether the North Korean government will use hyperinflation to basically debase the value of bonds like they did back in the 2003 to 2013 period when they last issued bonds, also unclear. But this is a sign, at least, that the North Korean government is under significant fiscal pressure if they are forced to issue bonds. And as I wrote in my slides, these bonds are apparently supposed to be equivalent to about 60% of the state budget for this year. And that's about 20% of GDP. So that is a clear sign they're under serious fiscal pressure. And look, we don't know how the North Korean public will react to such an issuance. We have already heard isolated reports of executions of some entrepreneurs who have refused to buy the bonds, but it's unclear how enterprises and other entrepreneurs or other wealthier North Korean individuals will respond to what is basically a forced purchase of bonds, which may never be repaid. And the North Korean government struggles with trust on these issues for good reason. It has stolen from its people many times before, and its people have memories. So they will no doubt be highly reluctant to lend money with little promise of ever getting it back. So we don't know how people might react. It could be bad. And also its economic impact, which I wrote about here, is quite clear. If you're taking large amounts of commodities, inputs from enterprises and potential liquid assets, potential capital from entrepreneurs, and the state is requisitioning that for its own projects, it's likely to have a very negative impact on economic output, and also on future investment. So you're basically starving the productive part of the economy of resources and redistributing it potentially to white elephant projects, which the state is so enamored of, like Kalmar, for instance, which I had mentioned earlier, but also the Prada handbags and the cognac and all of the other things that the elite enjoy consuming and which the regime buys them off with. And if we have this massive diversion of resources away from productive activity in this direction, that will have a very negative impact on the North Korean economy. And yet again, the North Korean people are not going to be happy about that. Okay, so I've given you some reasons to panic, but before you start panicking, I'm going to give you some reasons not to panic. Basically, the Chinese economy is getting better, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware. China is probably going to start importing more of the things that it's been importing from North Korea. So North Korea's trade supply of forex will probably recover. It could recover. And at the same time, the supply of oil seems to be normalizing to North Korea. So the fuel prices are going down, forex prices seem to be stabilizing, and food prices are down, which would indicate to me that, yes, there's been a lot of pain from Corona in the market, but it may finally be starting to subside. The North Korean regime, when facing such a situation, may decide to cut back its bond issuance, go a little easier on the people it's trying to basically expropriate by stealth, and that may minimize some of the damage that this will do. And then obviously we also, as I've written here, we have the bumper harvest from last year. So food supplies may be a little bit, so the North Korean government claims they had a bumper harvest last year. They may not have, but the food situation may be a bit better than they were previously leading us to believe with prior year's data. And on the policy front, more generally, to take a longer view, the North Korean government does not seem to be seriously and aggressively trying to roll back markets in society and inside the state-owned enterprise sector. So there are legally functioning markets. The state-owned enterprises can, to some extent, use market prices to sell their goods and also use markets to supply their operations. And there's no indication that these are being wholesale rolled back. And we have seen them do it before. So in the 2005 to 9 period, they really aggressively went after markets, both inside the state-owned enterprise sector and the actual markets where traders were trading. There were serious attempts to roll back the size of the market and also even to expropriate market dealers through a currency reform. And we are seeing signs that they may be heading in that direction, especially with this bond issuance, but we're not quite at the level that we saw especially in the latter half of the 2000s yet. So don't start running for the panic room quite yet. So to sum this up and also to give you some broader perspective why it is you spent the last 10 minutes listening to me, I would say that it's important to remember that although the North Korean economy may be very obscure, it's the last frontier. It's the frontier of frontier markets, and it's the last transition economy, as the OECD recently described it. In spite of those things being the case, and in spite of the fact that almost no one on this call will be able to do any meaningful trade or investment with North Korea for the time being, it's right next door to some of the most important economies in the world. Like it or not, China is right next door, as is South Korea and Japan. This is one of the most dynamic economic regions and one of the major producers of the world's most important intermediate and many finished goods as well. If there is serious instability in the north as a result of economic pain, it's something we're all going to have to be very concerned about. So it's worth keeping an eye on this, even though one sometimes has to delve into the obscure of how North Korean state-owned enterprises function. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So question here from Benedict. We are seeing reports several months ago that the North Korean medical system was nearing a breakdown of its capacity to prevent disease and epidemics. Do we have any evidence as what is going on with COVID-19? Is there any such evidence such as satellite images of mass graves or any other sort of data that we can rely on?
Yeah, the only satellite imagery we have of potential relevance is of a huge new hospital that the North Koreans are constructing right in the center of Pyongyang. It's called the Pyongyang General Hospital, and it's become a huge priority to get this thing finished by October 10th. I think it was announced maybe in March or something. It could just be coincidence that it was kicked off in the midst of all this COVID concern, but I feel like that maybe the sense of urgency may be related. But in general, COVID, the North Koreans continue to claim there are 0 cases. There's no real problem. At the same time, mask wearing is still de facto and is the norm. So the only other thing I would say is that we know that the North Koreans have only tested, I think, less than 1,000 people in the whole country. So when you do have such a low number of tests, it is easy to, without lying, say there is no COVID in the country.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to put a couple of questions together here. How would you see the US and the DPRK relations change under the leadership of Kim Yo-jong? And I guess looking at another question here is, if his sister was to be promoted, what would her ranking be, and how influential do you think she'll be within the state?
On the first question, I'm not sure to what extent relations are a problem of personalities. We never stop hearing about how good the chemistry is. Well, as in both the White House and the spokespeople from the North Korean Foreign Ministry never stop telling us how well Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump get along personally. The problems, I think, are structural, to be honest. I think that North Korea feels rightly or wrongly threatened by the United States and wants to have a nuclear weapon as both a defensive and potentially maybe also an offensive capacity. And it seems unlikely that they would be prepared to give that up under the Kim family. And I don't think a change in a Kim in charge would mark a reverse in policy in that area. And that would mean that it's unlikely that in the immediate term, relations between the two countries, the North Korea and the United States, would get better.
And just in terms of her titles, I mean, Kim Jong-un is chief and commander of various different areas of the North Korean administration. So presumably she would one by one start clawing those roles away. And it could start as a general, for example, 4-star general in the military, and then go up from there. I can see Daniel Pinkston's on the line, and he's written about that recently on NK Pro. Detailing some of the posts that Kim Jong-un has, and those would all have to be presumably picked up by Kim Yo-jong pretty quickly.
Fantastic. Just another question here. What can we expect from Korea relations after Moon's landslide victory in April?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that the problem, if COVID wasn't around, it could have potentially given a reboot to inter-Korean relations, which have been in chaos really since the failure of the Hanoi summit. One of the proposals that President Moon made in January about the potential for independent South Korean tourism to North Korea, it really riled some in the United States who felt that it was a way to get around sanctions and diminish sanctions pressure. Interestingly, the North Koreans haven't yet responded to this proposal. They haven't really criticized it. They haven't really acknowledged it. The only thing they got stressed about was that the US made some remarks about it, and they were quick to criticize that. So I would say that if this COVID stuff wasn't around, there's a potential that the North Koreans could be interested in pursuing that, especially if it could be on their terms. But right now, with COVID, it's very hard to see the North Koreans having bandwidth to engage seriously in any kind of inter-Korean relations in the short to medium term, I'd say.
Yeah. And given that mobilization is probably heavily restricted due to COVID, do you see much change in the way that the black market economy has been evolving in North Korea over the many years?
I mean, until recently, the government took a relatively tolerant attitude towards it. There have been signs of some additional restrictions being put in place recently, for instance, on the trade in foreign currency and the use of foreign currency to buy goods, and not everywhere, so at markets and also in shops. The regime seems to have also imposed some restrictions on imports as well. And you've got to ask whether these are COVID related or they are a part of a broader secular trend against and away from reform and towards retrenchment. And to me, there have been some signs of retrenchment in the last couple of years. So for instance, they changed rules regarding foreign trade, which are very, very important, was a very, very important plank of the liberalizations, if you want to call them that, or tentative partial reforms of the 2012 to 14 period. So those were reversed, but other reforms remain on the books, and it's unclear whether they're really interested in really starting to push up against markets. But then again, the bond issue is very, very concerning. So I think also, just to go back to something Chad mentioned earlier, I think also, not me personally, but there's some people in this office who've been doing some great reporting in the last year about Chinese tourism to North Korea. And this was clearly a massive revenue earner for them. And I think that the bond issuance may be connected with trying to plug gaps left by things like Chinese tourism and obviously other elements of trade. But either way, I'm not sure whether they are interested in really pushing against really starting to retrench, but signs are not good.
Another question here. How do you see the US election affecting US and DPRK relations this year?
I think the North Koreans are probably in a bit of a wait and see mode, but the key concern is that we have on North Korea, in the North Korean calendar, October 10th is the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Workers' Party of Korea, and it looks like there is a huge military parade being planned for that date. And in his plenum speech in late December, Kim Jong-un warned of a new strategic weapon that the world would soon see. And the concern is that they're going to wheel some serious new weapons technology out at that parade. And that will just be over a month off the US presidential election in November. It could be destabilizing if they decide to test that weapon. There's some talk it could be North Korea's forthcoming large submarine launched ballistic missile system. If they were to go ahead and say do a triple launch of new solid fuel SLBM missiles just over a month before the election, it's going to be troublesome, to say the least, for whoever is going to win and become the next US leader. I think they made clear in late December that the door is more or less closed to diplomacy with the US for the foreseeable future. They did leave it slightly ajar, which we shouldn't forget. There's still been some letters that have gone back and forth between Trump and Kim Jong-un this year. But I think from the North Korean perspective, the ideal situation would be to consider re-engaging in the new year once they are clear about who the president is and what their intentions may be.
Yeah, and just to add one extra thing, I mean, the US presidential election will be very important in determining, I think, the future direction of US-China relations. And if US-China relations continue on the trajectory they're currently on, this may present significant opportunities for the North Korean leadership, who potentially will be able to obtain more resources and more investment from a China that is less willing to enforce UN and US sanctions, at least more willing to turn a blind eye, should we say, if as opposed to less willing to enforce.
Thank you. A question here from Sean Sutton. Do you monitor defections, and have there been any change recently?
Sorry, what was that one? Could you repeat
that question, guys?
Hello?
And has there been any changes recently?
Sorry, we just heard, has there been any changes recently?
In defections.
Oh, right.
Has there been any defections and any changes recently?
I heard that the coronavirus has significantly impacted people's ability to leave the country as either defecting or legally, and there's been a large decline in the number of defections out of the country this year. That's what I heard.
Fantastic. Well, I think we might just leave it at that for now. If anyone's got any further questions or can learn a little bit about career risk, how can they get in contact with you?
I'm on Twitter /ChadOCL, and you can also go to careerrisk.com and K News. We've got lots of great resources for those of you who have to monitor North Korea stuff day to day. And if you'd ever like a free trial of our NK Pro service, please feel free to get in touch.
Fantastic. Well, once again, I'd like to thank our two special guests, Chad and Peter from Career Risk. It's been a pleasure speaking to you today, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.